I walked through the front door after another grueling day managing my real estate portfolio to find my mother Beverly standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed, wearing that cold expression I'd learned to fear as a child. "If you're not going to help this family," she said, her voice dripping with contempt, "then you don't get to eat with this family either." My heart stopped. After everything I'd done for them, paying the entire mortgage on this 4-bedroom house in the upscale neighborhood, covering every grocery bill, every utility payment, this was how she spoke to me. Behind her stood my golden child sister Quincy and her unemployed husband Landon, both wearing smug expressions like they'd just won some kind of victory. "What are you talking about?" I asked, though deep down I already knew this was about the master bedroom demand they'd made yesterday. Quincy stepped forward with that entitled smile she'd perfected since childhood. "Mom's right, Meredith. We need the master bedroom for when the baby comes. You're being selfish." I couldn't believe it. Here I was, a 32-year-old woman earning $100,000 a year as a real estate investor, and my own family was treating me like I was some kind of burden in the house I completely owned and financed. So let me give you some context. I'm Meredith, and for the past 2 years, I've been living with my parents Beverly and Russell in this beautiful house that I purchased entirely with my own money. This wasn't some desperate move back home, I'm the one who bought this place. My parents Beverly and Russell are both retired. She was a nurse, he worked at a bank. They'd been living in a cramped apartment across town, struggling on their pensions, when they mentioned wanting to move somewhere nicer. I thought, why not help them out? I was doing well with my real estate investments after years of grinding as an underpaid care worker, saving every penny and teaching myself about property markets and financial planning. The city had better opportunities for expanding my portfolio anyway. So I found this gorgeous 4-bedroom house in an upscale neighborhood. Since I'm paying the entire mortgage, every single monthly payment comes out of my account, I naturally claimed the master bedroom. It has a walk-in closet and an ensuite bathroom, which honestly felt like a basic right considering I'm financing everything. The second bedroom became my home office where I manage my properties and client meetings. The third bedroom stayed as a guest room, and the fourth was going to be my future nursery when I was ready to start my own family. Initially, everything worked perfectly. My parents were grateful to live somewhere so nice, and we established a comfortable routine. I didn't mind covering all the expenses. I'm pulling in 6 figures, and they barely have anything coming in besides Social Security. Plus, it's family, right? You help family. Then my mother dropped this bombshell over breakfast one morning, as casually as commenting on the weather. "You know, Quincy and Landon are having some financial troubles," she said. "Since Quincy's pregnant and they can't afford their rent anymore, we thought they could move in here temporarily." At first, I didn't react strongly. Quincy had always been the type to drift from one crisis to another, never quite managing to build a stable life despite being everyone's favorite growing up. A few days later, Beverly pulled me aside with that sweet, manipulative tone she'd used my entire childhood whenever she wanted me to sacrifice something for Quincy. "We've already told them they can stay with us," she announced. "It'll just be until they get back on their feet after the baby comes." Notice how my parents didn't ask if I was okay with this arrangement, they simply informed me after making the decision. I was still processing this when Quincy and Landon showed up the next week with suitcases and boxes, clearly planning an extended stay. Here's what happened immediately: they moved in and acted like they owned the place. I'm still paying the mortgage, still covering groceries, utilities, everything, but now I'm supporting 2 additional adults who contribute absolutely nothing. Nobody even pretended to ask if I was comfortable with this arrangement. Now don't misunderstand me, Quincy is my sister and I love her. But she's never been responsible for anything in her life. She's the type who expects others to solve her problems while she coasts through life expecting special treatment. And Landon, her husband, is just as entitled. He acts like the world owes him something just for existing. Within days of moving in, Quincy started making these passive-aggressive comments designed to make me feel guilty. "This house is so big, Meredith. You must feel lonely rattling around in here all by yourself," she'd say. Or, "When the baby comes, we're going to need so much more space for all the baby equipment." Then came the moment that changed everything. Last night, after I'd spent the entire day dealing with difficult tenants and property inspections, Quincy and Landon cornered me in the living room. So we've been talking, Quincy said with that same sweet voice Mom always used when asking me to give something up for her. It would make more sense for us to take the master bedroom. I stared at her in complete disbelief. The audacity was breathtaking. We need the extra space, Landon added, like this was some reasonable request. The baby will need room for a crib and all the supplies, and your room has a walk-in closet and private bathroom. Let me be crystal clear about something. I pay the entire mortgage on this house. Every month, $3,200 comes directly out of my account. The deed has my name on it. I pay for every grocery bill, every utility payment, every maintenance cost. I've been supporting this entire household without asking for a single dollar in return. And now they wanted me to hand over my own bedroom. I was stunned into silence for several seconds. Finally, I found my voice. The guest room is perfectly adequate. It's already furnished and ready. Quincy shook her head with that entitled expression she'd worn since childhood. But that room doesn't have enough closet space, and we need the privacy of the ensuite bathroom. I looked at both of them, trying to keep my voice level. I'm not giving up my bedroom, I said quietly. You can use the guest room, or you can find somewhere else to live. Landon looked genuinely shocked that I wasn't immediately caving to their demands, but Quincy looked furious, like I'd personally insulted her. So one day I had to drive across town to meet with potential investors about a new property deal. I got back around noon to grab lunch, and immediately noticed something that made my blood run cold. My personal belongings were scattered throughout the hallway. My designer clothes were piled carelessly on the floor. My laptop and financial documents were stacked haphazardly near the stairs, like someone had been interrupted mid-move. I walked straight to my master bedroom and found exactly what I expected, Quincy standing in the middle of my room, casually folding her clothes into my dresser drawers. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I demanded. She had the audacity to look completely unfazed, like this was perfectly normal behavior. "Oh hey, Meredith. Mom said we could start moving our stuff in here. We really need the extra space now." I felt my carefully controlled composure starting to crack. My mother Beverly, who contributes exactly $0 toward this mortgage, thought she could just hand over my bedroom to her precious golden child without even consulting me. "Absolutely not," I said, stepping into the room with authority. "You're not moving into my bedroom. I already told you the guest room is available." Quincy crossed her arms and gave me that entitled look she'd perfected since childhood. "The guest room doesn't have enough closet space or the private bathroom. We need more room for all the baby supplies." "I don't care what you think you need," I replied firmly. "You're not taking my room. I'm the one paying the entire mortgage on this house. I'm the one covering every single expense while you and Landon contribute absolutely nothing. If you need more space, you're welcome to find your own place." By this point, my anger was building rapidly. But Quincy wasn't backing down. "Mom already said it was fine," she repeated like that settled everything. That's when I reached my breaking point. I pulled out my phone and called Beverly immediately. "Mother, did you actually tell Quincy she could move into my bedroom?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. There was a telling pause before she answered. "Well, I thought it would be the most practical solution. They need the space, and you have your office. It's not like you're using the bedroom for anything important." "Are you out of your mind?" I snapped. "I pay every penny of the mortgage. I buy every grocery item. I cover every utility bill, and you think it's acceptable for Quincy to just commandeer my personal space?" Beverly tried to use her patronizing tone, insisting it wasn't a big deal and that families should make sacrifices for each other, but I was finished listening to her manipulation. "I'm not giving them my room, period. If they don't remove their belongings immediately, they'll need to find somewhere else to live." By this time, Quincy must have overheard my conversation because she came charging out of the bedroom looking absolutely livid. "You're seriously going to kick us out when I'm pregnant?" she shrieked. That's when Landon appeared, having heard the shouting from wherever he'd been lounging around. He stormed in looking indignant and ready for a fight. "What's all this yelling about?" he demanded. So I explained the situation clearly. "What's happening is your wife decided she could steal my bedroom without permission, and I'm telling both of you that it's not going to happen. You can stay in the guest room, or you can leave entirely." Landon immediately got defensive, spouting nonsense about family loyalty and how I should be willing to make sacrifices for them during this difficult time. Sacrifices? I laughed bitterly. I'm already sacrificing my entire paycheck to keep this household running. What exactly are you two contributing? Nothing. And now you have the nerve to demand my personal bedroom? The arguing escalated quickly after that. Beverly tried calling me back multiple times, but I ignored every call. I was too furious to listen to more of her excuses and manipulation. Landon kept rambling about fairness and family obligations and how I was being cruel to a pregnant woman. But I'd heard enough of their entitled demands. I looked directly at both of them and delivered my ultimatum: you have until tomorrow morning to remove your belongings from my room. If you don't, I'll handle it myself. Quincy stormed off dramatically, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows, while Landon stood there glaring at me like I was some kind of monster. The following day, I deliberately kept to myself, working from my home office and avoiding the common areas. By evening, I could feel the hostile atmosphere permeating the entire house. When dinner time arrived, I headed to the kitchen to prepare something for myself. I had purchased all the groceries just 2 days earlier, but when I opened the refrigerator, it was nearly empty. Every item I'd bought had mysteriously vanished. I said nothing initially, but when I moved toward the dining table, Beverly entered the kitchen. She methodically prepared plates for herself, Russell, Quincy, and Landon, then sat down with them. No plate for me. At first, I assumed it was an oversight, so I waited patiently. But she finished serving everyone else and they all began eating. I was left standing there like some kind of outsider, watching my own family enjoy the food I'd purchased. I addressed Beverly directly, keeping my voice steady. You didn't prepare a plate for me. She barely glanced up from her meal. If you're not going to help this family, then you don't get to eat with this family, she stated coldly, as if discussing the weather. I was stunned. Excuse me? I pay for everything in this house. The groceries, the mortgage payments, every single bill, and now you're excluding me from dinner? She didn't even bother responding. Russell just sighed quietly and continued eating like nothing unusual was happening. Quincy and Landon sat there wearing these smug, triumphant expressions, like they just won some kind of power struggle. I'd reached my absolute limit. I slammed the refrigerator door shut and walked out of that kitchen, my mind already working on what needed to happen next. I went straight to my home office, powered up my laptop, and began researching tenant eviction procedures. As a real estate investor earning $100,000 annually, I had extensive knowledge of property law and legal documentation. Within 2 hours, I had prepared professionally formatted eviction notices with all the proper legal language and statutory requirements. I printed out 3 sets of documents, one for Quincy and Landon, one for my parents Beverly and Russell, and one for my own records. Each notice was meticulously detailed, citing specific violations of our verbal agreement and establishing clear timelines for departure. Once everything was prepared, I walked into the living room where my entire family was lounging around, acting like their shocking behavior from dinner was completely normal. I didn't announce myself or explain what I was doing. I simply placed the legal documents directly in front of Beverly and Russell, then handed the second set to Quincy and Landon. What is this supposed to be? Landon demanded, picking up the papers and squinting at the official formatting. You have exactly 24 hours to pack your belongings and vacate these premises, I stated calmly, my voice carrying the authority of someone who owns property worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. If you're not completely gone by tomorrow evening, I will be contacting law enforcement to have you removed. Landon's face drained of all color. He clearly hadn't expected any real consequences for their outrageous behavior. You can't possibly be serious about this. I'm absolutely serious, I replied without any hesitation. I'm finished tolerating this disrespectful treatment. You've been living here as freeloaders, contributing absolutely nothing financially, and now you're demanding to take over my personal bedroom while excluding me from family meals. This ends now. Landon shot to his feet, attempting to intimidate me with his physical presence, but I remained completely unmoved. We're supposed to be family, he snarled through clenched teeth. You can't just throw pregnant people out on the street. Actually, I can, I said, taking a step closer to demonstrate that I wasn't intimidated. I'm the sole owner of this property. Not you, not Quincy, and not my parents. You've shown me zero respect in my own home, so you forfeited any right to stay here. Quincy immediately began her dramatic crying performance, as if tears could somehow manipulate me into changing my decision. I'm pregnant and you're literally kicking us out. What kind of heartless sister does this to family? I'm the sister who's been financially supporting everyone while you both take complete advantage of my generosity, I responded firmly. You have 24 hours to find alternative arrangements. That's far more consideration than you've shown me. Beverly, who had been sitting in stunned silence throughout this entire exchange, finally found her voice. Sweetheart, you can't really mean this. They're your sister and brother-in-law. We're supposed to stick together as a family. But I was completely done with her manipulation tactics. I've already made my decision, I said, gesturing toward the eviction notice in her trembling hands. You have 30 days to make your own living arrangements as well. If you're not gone by that deadline, I'll be pursuing formal legal action through the courts. The entire room fell into absolute silence after my announcement. Russell didn't utter a single word, just sat there staring down at the coffee table like he was trying to disappear. Beverly looked like she was on the verge of tears, but I felt no sympathy for any of them. The following morning, I woke up before dawn and made my way to the kitchen. The house was completely silent, no one else was awake yet. I brewed my coffee exactly the way I liked it, sat down at the dining table, and waited patiently for the inevitable confrontation. Eventually, Beverly shuffled into the kitchen looking absolutely haggard. Her face showed clear signs that she'd spent most of the night awake, probably crying and processing the reality of her situation. She didn't speak initially, just poured herself some coffee with shaking hands and settled into the chair across from me. Meredith, honey, she began, her voice barely above a whisper and thick with exhaustion. I realize now that things have spiraled completely out of control. I remained silent, simply staring into my coffee cup while I waited to hear whatever excuse or manipulation she was preparing to unleash. I honestly didn't understand how terrible the situation had become between you and Quincy, she continued, her voice beginning to crack with emotion. We genuinely thought we were helping your sister during a difficult time, and I suppose I was completely blind to how incredibly unfair we were being to you. You didn't just ignore my feelings and preferences, I said, my voice carrying a sharp edge that I made no effort to soften. You consistently took their side in every single conflict, like you automatically assumed I would just submit and let them take whatever they wanted from me. I know, she admitted, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. But we always thought, well, you've consistently been the stronger one, the more capable one. Quincy has always struggled with everything in life. And somehow you think my life has been effortless? I asked, my long-suppressed anger finally beginning to surface. I'm the one who saved every penny to buy this house. I'm the one who pays the entire mortgage every single month. I pay for every grocery item, every utility bill. I've been financially supporting this entire household without asking for any contribution, and you somehow think I can just continue this arrangement indefinitely? She stared down at her coffee cup, unable to meet my eyes for several long seconds. I do realize you've done far more than we ever had any right to expect, but Quincy is pregnant and facing such an uncertain future. I immediately cut her off. This situation has nothing to do with the pregnancy. This is about basic respect and human decency, and none of you have shown me either. She released a heavy sigh, clearly overwhelmed by everything that had transpired. We honestly believed we were making the right choices. Quincy and Landon really don't have many options or resources. And exactly whose responsibility is that? I shot back without hesitation. I never invited them to move in here. I never agreed to any of these living arrangements. They need to take responsibility for their own lives, and you need to stop enabling their complete dependence by sacrificing my well-being. She nodded slowly, finally beginning to grasp the full scope of what had happened. We'll work something out, she said, her voice much quieter now. Please don't force us to leave. Not like this, not so suddenly. I have no desire to force you out, I said, making an effort to keep my tone more reasonable. But fundamental changes need to happen immediately. I cannot continue living like this, being treated like my needs and feelings don't matter in my own home. Either the dynamics change completely, or yes, you'll need to find somewhere else to live. She didn't attempt to argue further, just nodded in silent acceptance. Understood, she said simply. We'll figure out how to make this work properly. Later that afternoon, Quincy finally emerged from wherever she'd been hiding. She looked like she'd spent hours crying and plotting her next move. She didn't bother with pleasantries when she walked into the living room, just sat down across from me wearing that familiar expression of wounded entitlement. So this is really how you want to handle things? She asked, her voice trembling with barely controlled rage. You're actually going to throw your pregnant sister out? I gave you 24 hours, I said calmly, not looking up from my laptop where I was reviewing my property portfolio. If you're still here tomorrow evening, I'm contacting the authorities. Quincy let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head like I was some kind of monster. We're family, Meredith. Yes, and family members don't steal each other's bedrooms or exclude each other from dinner, I replied evenly. You've had plenty of time to figure out alternative arrangements. I'm not your permanent safety net. She didn't have much of a comeback for that, just sat there glaring at me for several minutes before huffing dramatically and storming off. Classic Quincy behavior. When she couldn't manipulate the situation, she'd retreat to sulk. The next morning, I woke up knowing this would be the decisive day. Quincy and Landon had exactly 24 hours, and that deadline was rapidly approaching. When I made my way to the kitchen, the entire house felt different. The atmosphere wasn't exactly peaceful, but there was a strange calm quality, like everything was finally coming to a head. Eventually, Russell joined me in the kitchen. He moved quietly, poured himself coffee, and settled across from me at the table. For several minutes, he just sat there sipping his drink and staring out the window. Finally, he broke the silence. Quincy and Landon are leaving today. I didn't respond immediately, uncertain whether this was his way of informing me they'd made the decision themselves, or if he was simply acknowledging the inevitable deadline. I nodded and continued eating my breakfast. They don't have many options, he continued, his voice subdued. They'll be staying at a budget motel temporarily while they sort out their situation. I paused and looked at him directly. Part of me felt a twinge of sympathy, but the larger part knew this outcome was absolutely necessary. I gave them reasonable notice, I said, keeping my tone measured. I didn't want things to escalate this far, but their behavior forced my hand. Russell didn't attempt to argue or guilt-trip me, which was somewhat surprising. He simply nodded and returned to his coffee. Around midday, I could hear movement and voices from the guest room as Quincy and Landon began gathering their belongings. I remained in my home office, preferring to avoid any potential confrontations. However, after about an hour, I heard Quincy's voice rising in frustration from down the hallway. Predictably, she appeared at my office door shortly afterward. She stood there with that same defiant expression she'd worn since I'd served the eviction notice. You're really going through with this? She demanded, her voice sharp with accusation. You're just going to abandon us when we need help most? I leaned back in my chair and crossed my arms. I'd provided you with clear expectations and a reasonable timeline. You chose not to meet them. She shook her head, jaw clenched in anger. Family doesn't treat family this way, Meredith. This isn't who you used to be. I took a measured breath before responding. Family members also don't take advantage of each other's generosity. I'm not evicting you without cause. You've been living here for weeks without contributing a single dollar. I've been covering the mortgage, groceries, and every other expense. Instead of showing gratitude, you demanded my personal bedroom and participated in excluding me from family meals. I will not tolerate that treatment in my own home. Quincy stood there silently for several seconds. I could see she was angry, but she had no valid counterargument. Deep down, she knew her behavior had been completely unacceptable. So that's your final decision? She finally muttered. You're just throwing us out. I'm offering you the same choice I gave you yesterday, I replied firmly. You can find your own living arrangements, or you can stay in the guest room while showing proper respect for me and my property. If you can't manage that basic requirement, then yes, you need to leave. Quincy glared at me one last time, then turned and walked away without another word. I closed my office door and exhaled deeply. 24 hours later, I was sitting in my home office reviewing property documents when I heard the sound of car doors slamming outside. Through my window, I could see Quincy and Landon loading their final boxes into their beat-up sedan. I glanced at my watch. 6:47 p.m. They were cutting it close to my deadline, but they were actually leaving. That's when I heard Beverly's voice from downstairs, starting as a normal conversation but rapidly escalating. "Wait, you can't just leave like this." She called out to them from the front door. "Quincy, come back inside. We need to work this out." But Quincy's car engine was already starting. I heard the vehicle pulling away from the curb. Then came the sound I'll never forget. "No. Quincy, come back." Beverly's voice cracked as she screamed at the departing car. This isn't how families are supposed to work. Her cries grew more desperate and hysterical. "Meredith. Look what you've done. Your sister is homeless because of you." The screaming continued, echoing through every room of the house. "How could you do this to your own family? She's pregnant." I could hear her sobbing and wailing from the front yard, her voice carrying across the entire neighborhood. Russell's quiet voice was trying to calm her down, but Beverly was completely losing control. 24 hours. 24 hours and you destroyed everything." She shrieked, her voice raw with emotion. As her desperate cries filled the house, I sat back in my office chair and took a deep breath. The sound of her breakdown was exactly what I had expected when I chose to act in silence rather than argue. Sometimes, actions speak louder than words. And sometimes, the consequences of treating the person who pays for everything like they don't matter become crystal clear in the span of 24 hours. Beverly's anguished screams gradually faded to exhausted sobs, but the message was unmistakable: the golden child era was officially over. The house felt transformed after their departure. The oppressive tension that had been suffocating us for weeks was finally gone. Beverly and Russell were unusually quiet that evening, clearly still processing the dramatic turn of events. Later that night, Beverly knocked softly on my bedroom door. She entered hesitantly, sat on the edge of my bed, and stared at the floor for a long time. I could see she was struggling to find appropriate words. "They're really gone," she said quietly. I nodded without speaking. "I never imagined things would reach this point," she admitted, her voice heavy with regret. "I didn't fully understand the impossible position we'd put you in." I looked at her, feeling some of my anger beginning to dissipate. "It wasn't that I was unwilling to help," I explained. "But all of you treated me like my feelings and needs were completely irrelevant, like my personal space meant nothing." She sighed deeply and nodded. "You're absolutely right. We should have recognized what was happening much sooner." We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. I could tell she was genuinely upset, but at least now she seemed to understand my perspective. "I don't want you and Russell to leave," I said, breaking the quiet. "But if our family dynamics don't change fundamentally, I can't continue living this way." She nodded again, rising slowly from the bed. "We'll make it work properly this time," she said with conviction. "Things will be completely different. You have my word." As she left my room, I experienced a complex mixture of relief and exhaustion. The situation with Quincy and Landon was finally resolved, but rebuilding trust with my parents would require ongoing effort. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be simple, but at least now they seemed genuinely willing to listen and change. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe freely again. The house was peaceful, and that suffocating atmosphere of conflict had completely disappeared. While it wasn't a perfect resolution, I had reclaimed my personal space and, more importantly, my self-respect. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing and hitting the like button.